Hey everyone, and welcome back to All Things Architecture, where every building has a story. I'm Steve, and today's story is about how a design for a drive-in restaurant would eventually inspire some of the most influential modernist buildings in the world. Enjoy. On a warm August morning in 1945, an Indianapolis businessman named Joseph Cantor sat in his office and made a call to Chicago. On the other end of the line was the famed architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. During their call, Cantor discussed with Mies two projects he wanted him to design. Since Mies's arrival in America in 1939, he had enjoyed prominence within the world of academia. He was the head of the Illinois Institute of Technology's architecture department and was in the process of designing their new campus. Outside academia, though, commissions were few and far between, so anything was welcomed. Cantor continued to share his ideas. The first was for a 6-acre entertainment complex. For Mies's part, he would be responsible for designing, of all things, a bowling alley. Mies had never designed a bowling alley before, and probably never bowled in his life, but a commission was a commission. The second project was for a small summer house for Cantor and his family beside a lake. After the initial conversation, Mies got to work designing the two projects. However, rather quickly, Cantor shelved the entertainment complex, including the bowling alley. But with the bowling alley gone, Cantor looked at another business idea: a drive-in restaurant. As with the bowling alley, Mies wasn't too familiar with the concept of a drive-in restaurant. Mies didn't own a car until the 1950s, and when he did, rarely drove it himself. But again, a commission was a commission. The question was, how would his style of architecture work within the confines of the crass commercialism of roadside architecture? The drive-in restaurants of this era were a bit different from what would eventually become drive-through restaurants that we see today. In the 1930s and 40s, Americans were falling deeper in love with cars, spurring car-centric developments around the country. Everything from restaurants to drive-in movies to convenience stores and even churches managed to incorporate the car. These drive-in restaurants were essentially parking lots, where drivers would park their cars and be served by car hops, racing back and forth, carrying trays of food on real dishes and silverware. In the middle of this parking lot were often small buildings housing the kitchen and maybe a dining room. The buildings were dripping with neon, and some, like those designed by architects like Wayne McAllister, were capped with tall pylons, all aimed at attracting drivers passing by. Mies's restaurant would not be more of the same. Instead, it would be an opportunity to experiment with a concept that he had been toying around with as far back as 1928 with his Barcelona pavilion. It was a concept he called universal space, where a building's interior was freed up to allow for multiple functions to take place within the same space. It was a radical vision from the regimented arrangement of space based on their functions. To achieve this idea of universal space in the Cantor restaurant, Mies needed to rethink the structure of the building. He turned to Myron Goldsmith, an expert in structural systems, and devised a plan to construct two metal trusses, each spanning the entire length of the building, around 150 feet. From these trusses, the roof and glass walls would essentially hang down, allowing for an entirely uninterrupted interior. Inside, diners would sit in a well-lit space, with views in all directions. The kitchen would be in the back with a small series of rooms for storage and office and restrooms. By day, the building's jet-black metallic trusses would stand out against the mundane roadside architecture, attracting onlookers, with a direct line of sight toward the kitchen. At night, the building would illuminate like a modernist jewel with bright interior lights. Early designs featured neon signage and pylons that would further draw attention to the building, but these ideas would later be dropped for a sleeker look. Other changes included the name of the restaurant and how it would appear on the building. Early drawings reveal a plan to have the restaurant's name be Fairpost, a reference to the site's proximity to the Indianapolis fairgrounds. The name would appear in neon and run along the side of the steel trusses. Later models signify the name changed to Highway, which featured a subtle, sleeker sign between the two trusses. It appears that this was dropped because Cantor and Mies knew that the building itself was an advertisement, an invitation to dine in the future. As work progressed on the restaurant, so too did the plans for the summer house. but not as quickly. From the initial conversation in the summer of 1945, it wouldn't be until February 1947 that Mies would finally deliver some drawings, and this was only after Cantor sent letter after letter insisting on some working drawings. The design for the house was yet another experiment in universal space. The house was a large one, with 4 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms. The bedrooms bookended an expansive living space, complete with a fireplace and glass walls looking to the outside. And it wasn't just in the living space that got glass walls. The entire house was enveloped by glass supported by I-beams, with a flat roof capping off the structure. The strong horizontal lines of the building appeared to rise out of the ground like a plateau. But for as much enthusiasm as Cantor had for these projects, money and timing were becoming factors. The first of the projects to fall was the summer house. On November 24, 1947, Cantor wrote to Mies informing him that he had decided to sell the land the house would sit on, but left the door open to possibly finding a new site for the house. As for the restaurant, the rising costs and experimental nature of the building caused fears that the time it would take to recoup the cost of construction was too daunting to undertake. But even with this, Cantor would remain in contact with Mies well into 1950, even introducing him to local developers who would commission Mies to design an office building and apartment building. But again, those projects fell through because of a lack of money. And it would seem like this was the end of the story, but in many ways it's actually the beginning of another one. You see, at the same time as Mies is working on the Cantor house, he meets a doctor from Chicago, Dr. Edith Farnsworth, who commissions Mies to design herself a vacation home. Unlike Cantor, her house would take shape, becoming a fully realized vision of Mies's idea of universal space in a residential context, a vision that owed a bit to the Cantor house. And what about the Forgotten Restaurant? It appeared as part of an exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art in 1947. But more importantly, it would spark Mies's exploration into more ambitious expressions of space using a clear span structure. In 1952, work began on one of Mies's first public commissions, a theater in Berlin called the Mannheim Theater. But like the restaurant, this one never got built. But the best spiritual successor of the Forgotten Restaurant is back at Mies's IIT campus, which had continued to evolve over the many years. For the home of the Department of Architecture, Mies looked to the clear span structure of the Cantor Restaurant to create the striking Crown Hall, easily one of Mies's best-known buildings. Crown Hall marks the center of the campus and is vast in size at 25,000 square feet. Even more impressive is that the entire space is column-free. It's the culmination of Mies's attempts at universal space. The flexibility of the space allows students, not the architect, to define it, transforming it into whatever it needs to be, from a classroom to an art gallery. Outside, 4 jet black steel trusses, each about 120 feet long, straddle the building, offering much of the structural support. An idea that began with, of all things, a roadside drive-in restaurant. It just goes to show that no idea appears out of thin air. It begins as a spark, where it grows and matures. It's revised and revised still, and it might seem for a moment that it won't work. Until in one grand gesture, the idea leaps from the page, standing as a monument to never letting a good idea be forgotten. And that's our story. Thank you for watching. I'm Steve, and I'll see you next time with another edition of All Things Architecture, where every building has a story.